Some of the most rarest Islamic carpets come from Lahore. So there was this beautiful communal activity that came together to create something. And at times, the product in itself wasn't as important as it was, that it became a witness to all of these people's lives or all of these people's sort of communal belief that came together to create something.
सबसे पहले तो फातिमा आपका बहुत शुक्रिया that you've taken out the time for this second of a series on focusing on Lahori carpet, starting from a larger introduction to Indo-Persian carpets. और जो ऑनलाइन हमारे साथ लोगों ने ज्वाइन किया उनका भी बहुत शुक्रिया। और
Okay.
आज आज आपका सिंबलिज्म एंड टेक्निक है फोकसिंग मोर ऑन द लाहौरी टुडे, है ना? लास्ट टाइम इस पे
Yes.
खत्म किया था।
So last time, I think we sort of just did a bit of a more general historic understanding of how Lahori carpets came out to being, because Pakistan, and I would say even Lahore in itself, is a very complex and layered city or region. So there's a lot of different cultures that sort of came in together to create what we now call as Lahori. So I think last time we sort of went over Persian influence, Central Asian influence, Turkish influence as well, and how everything Indian, Hindu as well, and how everything sort of just came together to create the genre that we now call Lahori art or Lahori carpets. Um, Okay, great. Thank you everyone who's here. And now we're on the second part. And today I think I'm going to go a little bit more in detail in the different types of carpets that were produced in Lahore. So we're primarily talking 16th and 17th century, a little bit more emphasis, I would say, on the 17th centuries. और उसमें थोड़ा सा historically, like we've discussed in the first session, there's a lot of trans-regional layers that also come through this, with the influence of Persia, of Turkey, of Central Asia, even China to some extent. And I sort of wanted to go a little bit more in the symbolism and techniques. And then lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about why do we have this need to create a certain aesthetic when we're looking at carpet. So what was something that was driving people at that time to put so much focus on creating, sort of putting carpets inside the category of fine arts, or what was considered finer textiles, because there was not a lot of distinction between fine arts, textiles at that time, but there was a distinction between architecture and the arts. So it's quite interesting. And at the end, I want to sort of just leave with some questions about, which I think can just help us also understand when we're looking at the philosophy of art or its emphasis or importance in our culture or in our region, where that comes from. Is it still with us in a society? Is it something that we still ascribe to? Is it something that we still believe in? I wanted to start more specifically with Lahori carpet. So these are two visual examples. Hopefully you can see them. The one on the left this is a Lahori carpet. So this is right now in the Hong Kong Palace Museum, and it's one of their, so this is not on public display. There was an exhibition in 2017, I will put the date, where they had wonders of imperial carpets from the Islamic world, or usme they had certain carpets that were shown from different regions. And Lahore is quite interesting because some of the most rarest Islamic carpets come from Lahore, but the problem is that there's not many of them. And if we're talking about carpets that you can sort of access in public domains, such as museums or auction houses, It's very difficult to come across those. Many of them are still in private ownership or in private sort of residencies. The most rarest carpets or jo Lahori carpets hain, which started being produced in the late 17th century and early 18th century. I couldn't really find an image of it, but what I could find was something close to an image. So if you see this image on the right side, this is a Persian carpet from Kerman, and it's at Sotheby's, which is an auction house. And I know that they also did an auction on Lahori pictorial carpets, categorized वो उसको हमेशा ऐसे ही करते हैं. But these are actually maps. तो ये नक्शे वाले, we call these like, mapping carpets. And usually at that time, in the late 17th and early 18th century, these started becoming very valuable because they would quite literally have maps of India, of what encompassed India and Pakistan back then. They would have pictorial sort of depictions of ships. They would have pictorial depictions of how to get from India to Britain at that time. So there was a lot of, you could say, cartography that was also done, and especially of the sea. And it was quite literally woven on these carpets. And in a way, these carpets sort of became a map in itself to be able to reach from one region to another. With time, और उस वक्त जब British naval fleet थी, they started also investing a lot in these sort of carpets that were being produced. Many of them also had specific ships or specific sort of not sailors, but I would say like generals and the kind of fleets that they had. These were also being depicted on carpets. So I mean, the reason I sort of brought up this specific kind of carpet is that how even in the militarization जो उस वक्त हो रही थी in our region, or how these were also used in a way to sort of, kind of put your authority forward, in like imperial authority, quite literally through the art itself. These carpets are now extremely rare to find, especially the Lahore shipping or map carpets. I think there's one that I know of that somebody owns in Lahore, and I think they were also fixing it and they came across it. These ones are probably one of the most rarest ones that you can find. Many of them are usually quite small, so no bigger than 3 by 4 feet or 3 by 2 feet. अक्सर काफी छोटे होते हैं. The whole idea is just that you should be able to map out sort of a sea route on it. And it's quite interesting that we don't see these. We don't see these in museums. As far as I know, I don't think there's any of this in the Lahore Museum, and I don't think they've ever really displayed it. Maybe if they have it inside their archive, hard to say. I don't think they have it. What is interesting that you might be able to find some old maps, some old sort of sketches of these in the library, जो museum की library, with one which NCA also shares with them. Might be able to find some, but I think you'll have to look through quite a bit. So I just wanted to sort of bring this out in terms of the kind of symbols that could be woven on carpets as well. Many of them, as we discussed in the first sort of part of the series, many of them a lot of pictorial symbols were supposed to represent belief systems. Many of them were also supposed to represent stories that we carried. Some of them were also supposed to represent poems, folklore. And then aista you saw that more complex things started to be shown in these carpets. So you would have certain animals that are supposed to show certain ideas of existence. Then you had certain flowers that were supposed to show certain specific regions as well. Interestingly, Lahore ke jo carpets hote hain, unke andar you see a lot of palm trees that come up quite a bit, and you see the cypress tree, even though it's not, I'm not completely sure if it's indigenous to Lahore, but the palm tree is something which is usually used to kind of see that this is a carpet that was made in Lahore. And specifically, jo Lahore mein bante hain carpets, unme you start seeing palm trees coming up, you start see certain sort of colors come in. So the carpet as product and a craft form became important economically, and it developed into a medium that could convey cultural traditions. And so positions important stories, folk tales, maps, and religious beliefs as well. There's quite an interesting debate as well, how pictorial displays started to come inside carpets, or how it started to come inside Islamic arts. And there was this really interesting session that I kind of attended a couple of weeks ago, and it was about how certain regions ke andar, because of the type of Islam that had been adapted, specifically Iran, which was primarily Shia Islam, was the dominant religion at that time, especially during the Persian or Safavid empires. So they would start to put more and more symbolism and pictorial displays that kind of represented some of the stories that were integral to, whether it was for Muharram or whether it was for certain folk tales that are associated with some of their saints, or certain stories and certain tales that are associated with them. And slowly these started to come inside the carpets, or these started to also mix with the drawings that were being done or the miniatures that were being made. And then when that was adapted into the subcontinent by the Mughals, so they kind of took the idea of doing pictorial displays, but they completely changed it into something that would fit more towards the regional understanding of it. And then, of course, there's also some things that you adapt from Hinduism or Zoroastrianism, which were already regional sort of religions over here at the time. And slowly you see a lot of other tribal influences that also start kind of coming in. So the Lahori carpet is quite interesting because it's really sort of a cocktail of all these different things that came together. And many of these carpets are actually much more complex than the ones that were the blueprint. So, for example, there's always a comparison that is done with like Persian carpets, specifically those that are made like in Iran, or that are made like in Iranian cities, Isfahan, etc. And then when you compare it with the same Indo-Persian carpet, you see that there's a bit of a difference in how complex the carpet has become in terms of the kind of symbolism that is being used. And at times, it's not just Islamic symbolism that is put inside these carpets. You see certain specific sort of symbols that are associated with Chinese mythology, that are associated with Hindu mythology, that are associated with Buddhism or Zoroastrianism. One of the most famous examples of this is the chil, or jisko what we call chile. It actually comes from Chinese motifs of phoenix. And then because the Chinese word for phoenix is actually chi lin, and then we kind of adapted that and it became the chile, which eventually became the bird, or just sort of became a synonymous word to use for birds in symbolism. So it's quite interesting is that how over time certain symbols sort of adapted their own life because of how complex or how layered our region generally was, or in how we associated certain symbols with with certain symbols with how we were showing them pictorially. So I wanted to do a bit of a run through the type of carpets that we already exist in our region, and most of these examples are from Lahore, or carpets that were made in Lahore. And I think some of you might be familiar with these sort of carpets, so you must have heard of this terminology. So one of the first is the vase carpet, this is from the 17th century. This is actually one of my most favorite carpets as well. This is a pashmina carpet, which is something that is considered one of the most rare carpets because it is, again, quite small and it's made from pashmina silk. So it's very rare. And I think this is one of 5 that are publicly you can sort of see in museums. This one belongs to the auction house, and this is right now it was at Sotheby's, but then they gave it to the museum, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's still privately owned by somebody else, however, but they allow it to be shown in exhibitions. So the vase carpet usually has sort of this vase kind of a motif that runs through it. Borders are usually thicker, but the jo uska foreground or battleground, as you can even call it, the central part is always divided into these 4 vase like sections. And this carpet always usually has more naturalistic symbols. So you have flowers and plants, and it's always sort of organized around one central point, which can be a medallion, but doesn't have to be. And there's always 4 subsections in most of these. And there's different types of vase carpets that you can also see. Some of them are quite simply done. Some of them are quite complex. Some of them can also be a mix of a vase carpet with a pictorial carpet, or a vase carpet with a mihrab carpet, which is a prayer carpet. And this is one of the rare Mughal Pashmina carpets. This was made in Lahore during the time of Shah Jahan, so we put it on the 17th century. And it's one of the finest ones made, but I will have an example of what is considered one of the finest carpets, silk carpets, that was made during the Mughal times, which was almost, I think it's 2,500 knots per square inch. And there's only a very small piece of it that survived. The rest of it, we have no idea where it is. Okay, so apologies for this horrible picture. So the second type is the sailor main carpet, which comes from Turkey, and it comes from Turkmen sort of nomadic weavers, and it's known as a main carpet. So carpet ke functions be different hote the depending on the size and also the materiality that is used. So jo aapki these sort of sailor main carpets, which I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen this kind of pattern, it's quite common. These are used as an entrance carpet. These are quite long, usually quite large. They can go up to 20 feet. They can go up to even 40 or 50 feet as well, depending. And these carpets are mostly used as an entrance, which is why they're made out of coarser material, usually wool. And maybe with a little bit of silk mixed in, but mostly it would be wool. The idea being that it's, for rough use, and it's sort of an entrance carpet as well, which is why it sort of had these spaced out medallions made. What's interesting is that the reason why this specific kind of pattern is used is because it's supposed to show, it's supposed to be like a star, like a sky full of stars almost. So it's like you're entering into someone's threshold, or you're almost entering into someone's, you could say, I won't say galaxy, that's a bit too romantic of a notion, but suppose you're sort of entering into someone else's orbit. So they're sort of welcoming you with stars at your feet. So there's always a lot of generally in our culture, I think there's a lot of emphasis on giving a lot of respect to the person that is coming into your domain, and you sort of have to. There's also certain romantic notions that are associated with it, so you sort of go above and beyond in how you're welcoming them in. This style was mostly came out from tribal weavers from Turkish, Turkmen sort of regions. Eventually, it was adapted largely into the subcontinent as well. And we still kind of see a lot of these carpets, but usually you put these towards the entrance. Tribal carpets, we have different variations of. Tribal carpets are a little bit harder to categorize because every sort of tribe has their own symbols that are important to them, or certain motives that they use. Some of them can be on nature, some of them can be religious, and they have also their own color palettes. So, for example, where you see more influence of Central Asian or Persian tribes, you'll see sort of more reds or like blood orange coming through in the color palette. Where you see Turkish or Turkmen influence, there's a lot more use of blue, there's a lot more use of sort of indigo as well. In Lahori carpets, it becomes even more complex because we used both. So one of the things about the way that carpets are woven, specifically the Lahori carpets were woven, they made use of 2 types of weaves. So in most carpets, how we categorize is there's Persian weave, and then there is a Turkish weave. Persian weaves are sort of more rounded, and they can create more organic forms with them, so it's easier to create circles. Turkish weaves are generally more geometric, and they follow a very strict sort of geometric weaving pattern. So you can't really go very far in terms of what sort of, rounded or organic shapes you can make it. They generally tend to be more geometric. Lahori carpets took both of those weaves and kind of adapted them in within one carpet. So you see different types of weaving techniques being done on the same plane, which is usually why a lot of the weavers that were like Lahori weavers, many of them, some of them were Persian, some of them were Turkish, some of them were Kashmir. But a lot of them were sort of trained to weave 2 or 3 different types of techniques within the same carpet. And this is something that still exists even now. Most carpet weavers को 2 या 3 different weaving techniques आती हैं, which is quite interesting because if you, for example, go to Iran, or if you, for example, go to Turkey, primarily they only know one technique, one way to weave, like one weaving technique. Whereas if you come towards our region, weavers usually know more than one. And they use them quite, like they sort of interchange between both techniques quite easily. And it's sort of quite interesting because it allows a lot of variation in the sort of carpets that are being produced, which is again why I come to this point that in Lahore, the kind of carpets that were made were technically much more different, and I would even say difficult, than the ones that you see coming out of, for example, Iran, or the ones that you see coming out of Turkey or Central Asia. Okay, so then we have the medallion or the 𝐶𝐴 carpet, which is from late 16th century. This was a Persian carpet, eventually adapted into the subcontinent, and we also sort of adapted, the aesthetics of it. It is mostly defined by having a central center medallion, and then you have these 4, like it's the same circle sort of cut into four parts. So you have different variations of, the semi or quarter of the circle on all 4 corners. The interesting thing about this carpet, the medallion carpet, is that it can represent the sun and the moon both. So the center is supposed to always signify the sun in its all totality, so it is a complete circle. Whereas the corners are always supposed to signify the moon, the phases of the moon. So you have, like a half moon phase, or you have different phases of the moon that are shown by different parts of the circle. You can also see slight color differences or slight design differences as well to signify the lunar sort of cycle, which is usually on the corners. And then you have a different sort of design, or you have different sort of color to depict the sun. Usually the sun is often shown with gold or yellow color palettes, although there are some instances where we have seen the sun also being depicted as red or sort of, very dark, deep maroon. This one is probably the most, I think, detailed, one of the detailed carpets that I could find, because as you can see, the sun is also surrounded by this navy blue, like very dark blue sort of color. And this is supposed to actually signify, so wherever you see very dark blue in carpets, especially these sort of medallion, like sun and moon carpets, the navy blue is always supposed to depict the universe. So it's sort of very interesting because they show, the sun outside, and then, it's sort of surrounded by the galaxy, which is like an infinite sort of darkness. It's quite interesting that they had these, that astronomy had such an impact on aesthetics at that time, and weavers or designers or, manufacturers were really showing these things and what they were creating as well. The red or parts are usually supposed to depict this realm, like this physical realm that we live in right now over here, the Earth. And if you kind of even see in the borders, you can see certain animals as well, which will go into a little bit more detail about what certain animals are supposed to depict. I have a slightly long description that we can look into, which tells us about what winged creatures are supposed to signify, what hoofed creatures or domesticated creatures are supposed to signify, and what sort of predatory creatures are supposed to signify as well. And again, you can see the phases of the moon over here as well, which is on the sides of the borders over here. Aksar Either it might be a little bit difficult to see, but a lot of the carpets often have the weaver or the Naqshbandan, which is the designer. They will usually have a signature, or they'll have their name on the side of the carpets. Some of them would not put their names because they sort of considered it irrelevant. So many of them would even sometimes put either an ayat from the Quran, or they would put sort of a verse from one of the poems of either Rumi, or you know, or even sort of something from literature from Al-Ghazali, or something that they sort of identified with, and it would sort of just be woven usually at the backside of the carpet. अक्सर हाथ से भी कर लेते थे लोग, or sometimes if they could, they would weave it quite literally into the carpet. Which is why we also don't have that much depiction of knowing exactly who wove which carpet. It's quite interesting the way we sort of weavers at that time, or generally people, how they associated identity with the carpet, because there is no concept of the individual in sort of traditional Islamic art, especially these sort of social arts, which are based on, a lot of like a group coming together to create something. The idea of individuality was seen, it was seen as a sort of selfish, and didn't really have a lot of positive aspects to it. So the artists were seen in totality, like the entire group was seen as the artists. There wasn't this egoistic sort of characteristic of the artist being like, it is me who is the person that made this. It was more about us from this region made this carpet. And it didn't really single out one person over the other. So it also talks a lot about the way holistically a community came together to create something, as opposed to one person sort of being at the top of the food chain, or at the top of everything, and sort of taking all the profits for themselves. So garden carpets, these are quite interesting and usually quite difficult to come across. They're not made, they're quite rare. And yeah, Mughal carpets, or generally in Lahori carpets, you can see that these garden carpets are specifically supposed to sort of symbolize paradise and nature. And so they're always divided into these four planes. So, like typical Persian gardens, where you have these four sort of division of the garden. Most of these always usually have cypress trees inside them, flowering plants, sometimes animals, not all the time. And so the cypress tree is something that you'll see quite a bit. What's interesting is that by the time the cypress tree came to Lahore, the color and the shape of it changed, and it became a bit more localized, I would say. But it is still a very important symbol, or like the cypress tree is also supposed to represent the tree of life. So the idea of immortality, or the idea of rebirth or regeneration. And you can also see this in quite a few of the mosques. I think Wazir Khan Mosque has some really beautiful tiles of the tree of life or the cypress tree motifs made. The shape, I would say, sort of changed. It looks more like one of our local flowering plants or local bushes. It doesn't exactly look like a tree. And what's also interesting is the way they sort of depicted immortality was through the color. So blue is often used to depict immortality, as opposed to other colors. The idea being that blue is the closest color to water, or is the closest color to the cosmos. And you can kind of live forever, if you're sort of, I would say, synchronized with things outside of yourself, or if you're synchronized outside of your bodily or physical realm. The other way that the Mughals often also believed in sort of ensuring that they were immortal was to have a lot of children. A concept that still actually exists, which is why we also have a lot of craft or a lot of art where, you have this idea of passing it on through the family, or you sort of have certain families that specialize in certain craft. The idea being that the craft will not really sort of die out because it lives on through the next generations, which is sort of how some of our vocational or traditional arts were, designed. So you have symbols of rebirth, you have symbols of growth and fertility. Flowers often depict fertility, and divinity is often showed with, again, flowers or sort of continuity patterns. जिसको हम कहते हैं, these are usually arabesque, or can even be geometric. One of the more interesting sort of ways when Islam was adapted into, when it sort of was adapted, I mean, Mughals are mostly Muslims, and generally in the subcontinent, Islam sort of became as an emerging religion, and it became one of the more faster growing religions, more popular religions. So a lot of the aesthetics of Islamic art was also adapted into the carpets that were being made. And the mihrab carpet, yeah, which is usually what we use for prayer, like even the janamas. So this comes directly from influence of architecture, of trying to show sort of the arches, and it's supposed to sort of depict your direction towards Makkah, depending, on which side you sort of put it. And this is one of the oldest ones, which was from the 17th century. This is a Pashmina mihrab carpet. And it's a flowering design. Again, this was made in Lahore. So you can see that within the mihrab carpet, there is a couple of different other symbols as well happening. So you have the tree of life, which is sort of in the center over here. And it's sort of represented by a specific sort of, let's see if I can sort of zoom in a little bit. So there's a different kind of flower that is shown. And you can see, look over here. So you have the mihrab in itself. We know this is a prayer carpet or janamaz, and then within the prayer carpet you have the tree of life symbol, so immortality through connection with the divine. So there were sort of layers of towards how Islam or Islamic aesthetics were adapted as well. It wasn't very much rooted in orthodoxy as it is now. There were more sort of intangible elements to the way that Islam was sort of seen or had been adapted, especially in the arts. And geometry, I think, is one of the best ways to understand this. There's always a lot of debate as to why in Islamic arts there's not a lot of pictorial displays as opposed to, suppose, Christian art. And it's quite interesting because geometry is sort of seen as the closer relationship to the divine. And it's interesting that use of mathematics in the arts is seen as a closer relationship with, the divine or understanding of the divine world. Whereas in Christian art, it's a lot about what you speak so you can visualize, whereas in Islamic art, it's like what you speak so you can write. Slightly different interpretations, but either way. So you can see over here as well, this is another good example of a mihrab and pictorial carpet, and also with other symbols such as the trees. And you can kind of see over here that there is a slight difference in the nature of the animals as well. So over here you have sort of a dignified peacock, which are often used to represent masculinity, not femininity. You can, if you sort of look a little bit closer, you can also see pineapples. You can see pomegranates as well. Pomegranates are often a very important symbol of showing fertility as well, and also quite closely associated with Islam as well. You can see over here that there's a very different pictorial display of, sort of hunting, which is always used in a lot of Islamic symbolism. This scene of hunting, of being hunted, of hunters, and it always comes down to this idea of these universal laws we have of understanding, this pull between good and evil. And that's not to say that somebody specifically out there is evil or somebody specifically out there is good, but a lot of these battles are often internal, which is what is quite interesting in Islamic art or in Islamic depictions, that it's a lot about the internal struggle that man has with themselves, with their own egos, with their own nafs, something that we touched upon last time as well. But these are again and again showed in different forms, whether through symbolism, whether through sort of stories, or whether through even carpets. Um, So this is a fragment of a part of a carpet. This was made in Lahore. This is at the Met right now, Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so this is just the fragment that remains. What we've managed to depict from this fragment is that this was most probably a mihrab, like a praying carpet or an arch, because you can see aksar jo praying carpets or the mihrab carpet often have columns on the sides to sort of depict a certain kind of direction. And this is all that survives of this carpet, which was made here. And this is considered one of the finest examples of carpet weaving because of its sensitive drawing. And again, a very high knot count, so almost 2,550 knots per square inch. And this was all done by hand. And we know that there's a flowering plant in between, which was most probably again supposed to depict the tree of life symbol. But because this is all that remains, it's a little bit hard to know exactly what the rest of the carpet would have looked like or what it would have shown. But it's a little bit similar to sort of this original mihrab carpet that we saw. Okay, so wanted to come on to a couple of questions that what made carpets traditionally so important to the culture or the communities living in the subcontinent. And a couple of points that we have is first, we know this was a very important ways for people to sort of tell their stories. So oral tradition has been very important in our region for a long time. But one of the best ways to sort of make sure that an intangible form of, art continues is that you put it in a tangible medium. And carpets, many pictorial carpets show a lot of very interesting folk tales such as Layla Majnu or, the adventures of Rustum. And then slowly we started to see a lot of our regional stories also coming inside these carpets that were made. There's quite a couple of carpets that were made in Lahore that show images of, the adventures of Rustam Pasha, or they sort of show different sort of folk characters and their kind of, battles with good and evil, or them sort of, migrating from this plane to another plane. These carpets often also had, again, superimposed sacred meanings. So there was, like we saw the South Asian gardens, we also saw the mihrab carpets. A lot of these were supposed to be ways for people to use these as a medium to meditate, to reflect within what was being taught to them, but in a medium that was perhaps not just oral or written, but also sort of a visual way to understand what they were living in or what they were believing in. The carpet was also a very important medium that connected the body to physical space. The idea that the carpet is made of fabric or clothing is very essential because there's a certain material relatability that you have with something, because our clothes, they're made out of fabric, they're made out of silk, they're made out of cotton, they're made out of wool, and carpets were usually made out of those same materials. So it was sort of this material familiarity that you have with the things that you're making. Over here, I would go a little bit into another direction as well, where it comes to Islamic sort of art. A lot of our art was made for the idea of usability. So there's a functionality behind whatever you have made. अगर आपने कालीन बनाया है, या if you've made a house or you've made a certain textile, or you're producing a certain book cover, there's a certain functionality behind everything that was being created. Because this idea of luxury in art, or art that is just meant to be looked at. There's nothing wrong with this, but the idea that art can be both beautiful and it also serves a functional purpose is quite interesting, because it sort of opens the door that art is exclusive or something that only has to be seen if you go to a specific space, which we see a lot in Western art. Like, unless you go into museums or you go to studios, then only you can see art. But in Islamic art, you see that there is no classification, or there is no sort of barrier between art being restricted to certain spaces or art only being accessible in certain ways. The idea was that it is something that any and everybody can have around them, if you choose to sort of have beauty around you. Over here, I just want to sort of show you two examples of complicated sort of pictorial carpet. So this is the Emperor's Carpet. This is from 16th century Iran. And something similar was made in the Mughal times. So this is a carpet with palm trees. And this is just to sort of show you, like, this is a very classic Persian carpet, and this is a very classic Mughal carpet. So you can see that there were certain pictorial things that were adapted, certain symbols that were adapted. But then you also see things such as palm trees. You sort of see these star inlays, hexagonal shapes, which was very typical of Mughal sort of aesthetics, which were sort of being used inside these carpets as well. And a lot more complex visually than, the blueprint which they had sort of taken these carpets from, which was the Persian or the Iranian carpets. This is also in the Metropolitan Museum. It is on display, but they have, I think, one of the largest sort of collections of Lahori carpets, and this was made in the early 17th century, late 16th century. And I wanted to just sort of go into a little bit of more detail of the exact symbol of a hunting carpet. So I would actually like to read the description, because I feel that when you're sort of watching this, looking at it, it kind of makes sense. So the pictorial display of hunting carpets, which often shows wild beasts in ornate garden adorned with plants in the presence of domestic or wild creatures, is a famous pattern favored by royals and nobles alike. So the word dam means net or snare, trap, both in terms of the physical object as well as referring to the metaphorical delusional nets of the material world, while the word also refers to animals with horns. So you will see a lot of horned animals, which are supposed to represent the dam or a net. In many pictorial carpets, tigers or lions are supposed to symbolize the Sufi or the reflective individual who must navigate through the traps of the material world, which are these domestic, beautiful, birds and beautiful sort of domestic sort of animals, and overcome temptations and weaknesses towards a path running from the center of the divine sun gate, which is usually the medaillion, central motif in the carpet, or can even be the borders of the carpet. Deer antlers are often shown in some state of movement, signifying the fleeting nature of vices and fragile nature of the animal when confronted with startling informations. Symbolism can be interpreted in a second way, that is to show beauty and gentleness of these animals, signifying their importance in the social lifestyles of the time. The use of color depends solely on the intentions and visions of the carpet designer. This description of the common scenes depicted in pictorial carpets demonstrates the way a carpet could be a map for understanding human nature and relationship between the individual, the ego, and the natural world. So I just wanted to sort of show that even the way that the animal is depicted, whether running, whether hunting, whether calm, is also supposed to sort of show the complexity of human lives or human nature when confronted with society at large and the different sort of things that we have to face. And while these may seem as very small things, I think when you sort of step back and think about it, that at the time people were creating everything that was being made around us, or everything that was being created had a certain purpose or it had a certain intention behind it. And nothing was just put into these carpets or into any other sort of pictorial form of art just for the sake of it. There was a conscious decision to depict certain ideas at that time. So we sort of come from a very complex understanding of how art or how the importance of art and nature to human existences and how it was depicted in these carpets is quite interesting. I mean, I think, and it's also something that gives you a lot to think about of how conscious people were when they were creating, as opposed to when you now look at how we create today or how we live our life or how we live our lives. There's a huge difference in the sort of thought process that people had or the way people were invested in, things around them or the sort of kind of uh, way of living they had, whether it was even through the way that they kept their houses or even if it was, the sort of clothes they wore. This is sort of the whole detailed pictorial carpets the description. I've also given the reference over here if anybody wants to sort of go a little bit more into detail. Okay, I think we can stay here. So I just wanted to sort of come a little bit towards the end and talk a little bit more about how we understand aesthetics. I think we gone a little bit ahead of time than I'd wanted, but I'm just wrapping up. So Uldumane Ukunake is a North African scholar, and he wrote this really wonderful paper which is called Why Beauty is Not Optional, and he is an Islamic scholar. And one of the things that he talks about is that indifference to beauty is indifference to the divine. And if you think about the aesthetics that we have in, or even if you put aesthetics aside, or if you sort of just look at the sort of intention or the what Islam says in terms of how we live our lives and how that is translated into Islamic art is quite interesting. Because a lot of Islamic art is built on, of course, sort of coming closer to the divine or sort of, understanding the macrocosm, the world outside of us, the galaxies, universe, God in itself. We're trying to understand the universal laws that, in every culture, but I think specifically in Islamic aesthetics and Islamic art, there is this need of trying to recreate the macrocosm into the microcosm. And the way we do that is that we take these bigger notions and sort of try to put them into, smaller ways, whether we do it in carpets, whether we do it in gardens, whether we do it in architecture, whether we do it in calligraphy, whether we do it in geometry. So one of the most important things that I feel, while this can get maybe a little bit complicated, I feel that one of the things that we sort of have deviated away from is how we look at beauty or how we understand beauty. I mean, one of the most important aspects of one of the names among the names of God, you have Al-Jalal, you have Al-Jamil, Al-Jamal as well. And Jalal, I feel like, is always something that is used or given a lot more weightage than Jamal. And Jalal, while it's supposed to sort of show the majestic, Jamal is supposed to be the merciful, the beautiful, almost the more effeminate associations that we see with, certain attributes of God. But at the same time, there is a certain understanding or there's a certain requirement for us to sort of look at beauty in things and sort of surround ourselves with beauty. I mean, we all have heard this and we know that God, is beautiful and God loves beautiful things. And that is not to say that, if you're not talented as an artist or a painter, that, you cannot make beauty or you cannot be surrounded by beauty. You can also say it through the way you talk to people, the way you sort of present yourself, the kind of things you surround yourself to. And I think one of the things when I sort of look at, especially with Islamic sort of arts, when I look at specifically at carpets, it's a very simple, if you sort of think about it, it's a very simple object. It's simply, a form of sort of textile in our interiors that we use. But the fact that it was given such a high sort of status, that there was so much investment done inside it and not just perfecting its aesthetics or its sort of visual symbolism or the kind of quality or the technique that was being produced. But that sort of is a huge reflection on the importance that at the time the Islamic world gave to the arts, or even whether, especially the tangible arts, and how important it was to ensure that there was a bridge between our intangible notions or our understanding of the world and to find a tangible way to sort of depict them. And when you sort of look at where we are right now, there's a huge difference amongst, we've sort of gotten so caught up in certain ideas of what is supposed to be beautiful, what is not supposed to be beautiful. We're so sort of a little bit, I would even say, hesitant, whether it's because of orthodoxy or other reasons. Self-expression or sort of trying to understand the divine or the world around you is not something that a lot of people do anymore, or not something that a lot of people focus on anymore. So I think these carpets are sort of a good way to start thinking about why beauty is actually not optional for us specifically. And even if you sort of take Islam out of this, or if you are like, okay, that's something, whether or not you agree with, that's your personal business. But even if you sort of take Islam out of it, it's very common for human beings to be attracted to beautiful things. And there's a certain light, or there's a certain attraction we have towards beauty. And it's sort of responsibility you have, I think, or that we have generally, to surround ourselves around. I mean, we know what the state of the world is, we know what our lives are like. And I think now it's essential, even more so, to focus on trying to sort of create this environment of beauty, or sort of create this environment of harmony, something that can uplift not just our own spirits, but also other people around us. Which is why I sort of come to this point of community. In Islamic or generally traditional arts, there was such an emphasis on community, because there was no idea of individualistic pleasure or materialism. It was something that was meant to be shared, and it was something that everybody sort of came together to create, to take part in, or sort of to be a part of. Whereas now we have sort of fallen very far away from the idea of sort of communal, collective, traditional arts. And if I look back at these older carpets that we made, this was not just one person who was creating or weaving these carpets. These were up to 50, 60 people. You would have somebody you had like, and if I sort of even expand the supply chain even more, I would say even up to 100 people. You had farmers, people who were sort of where you were kind of getting the resources from. You had the dyers, you had the weavers, you had the designers, yeah, the Naqshbandan, the people who would draw the maps. You had the people who decided they had to sell this. Where do you sell this? You had students who were learning it. So there was this beautiful communal activity that came together to create something. And at times, the product in itself wasn't as important as it was, that it became a witness to all of these people's lives, or all of these people's sort of communal belief that came together to create something. I will stop here because I don't want to run too ahead of time. But I feel if there's any questions, or if there's something that we want to specifically go in more detail with, I would be happy to do that.
Thank you. That was a very nice presentation, and also touched upon the larger philosophical points. ये भी आप बोलना चाह रही हैं ये वाले?
This is just sort of a little bit, I mean, I don't know if you have time to go inside this. But this was just sort of a hadith that I was reading a couple of days ago, and it was about, sort of this idea of worshipping, again, the idea of worshipping God, and this concept of ihsan, which we often use to understand excellence. But ihsan, the root word of it in Arabic, can also mean to imagine. And again, it comes back to what we were talking about, like imagination allows for us to explore artisanal sort of vision. And it's not something that we are discouraged from or have been discouraged from. It's something that we're actually encouraged to do, because it's quite literally a part of our, our belief or our faith. I'll stop here. I feel like I've gone a little bit ahead of time, but
No, that's fine. We can now open the floor. If anybody has any questions, they can raise their hand.
Fatma, the last slide was really awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
oh,
Overall, your presentation is very great. A lot to learn. Is it possible for you to share your presentation with us or post it on your LinkedIn or somewhere? So, because there are some points I really would like to take notes on.
ये upload हो जाएगी ना, ये इसकी
Oh,
recording
yeah. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
جی یہ ہسٹوریکل پرسپیکٹو بڑا ہی انٹرسٹنگ تھا ود imagery. This was very, very interesting.
ویسے ایک sort of I don't know, I should call it a correction or an addition کہ وہ جو لفظ احسان ہے اسلامک ٹریڈیشن میں it is sometimes it is supposed to carry a double meaning. One is the best act, excellent act, and the other is the most beautiful act کیونکہ احسان اور حسن کی روٹ ایک ہی ہے.
Yes, that is true. I missed that one. Yeah.
That is also interesting. Very, very interesting, yes.
But I mean, I really find this quite interesting how linguistics plays such a huge part in the things that we are not just writing, but also quite literally making. And if you sort of linguistically start breaking down concepts, it's often quite, you're like, oh, that's literally all it was. It was quite easy. But hum log linguistically sochte nahi na. We always compartmentalize everything so much. And we have this obsession now, unfortunately, because of our modern schooling systems, however you want to put it, this incessant need to compartmentalize that you often can't see things in a holistic way.
صحیح ہے.
میں نے جو آپ کو کہا نا کہ یہ لاسٹ سلائیڈ آپ کی بہت ہی امپورٹنٹ تھی اس لیے کہ احسان از آلویز لائک پلیس ایز اے برڈن. یو مے ہیو ہرڈ پیپل سیئنگ I don't want anybody to ihsan on me, like, because in our culture we always say so. For me to introduction of ihsan as an imagination and awareness of Allah, so that's why I said this last slide was really kind of cherry on top. Because like
بالکل صحیح کہہ رہے ہیں.
یہ میرے لیے بالکل نیا ہے جو آج یہ جو بات ہوئی ہے اس لیے یہ بہت ہی خوبصورت ہے. And thank you Fatima for brought that up for us.
I wanted to thank you. Absolutely wonderful and very enlightening presentation. One comment that I want to make, or maybe a question, is that do you think that all of these visual iconographies, whether it is in the carpets or whether in the illumination or in the geometry, do you think it sort of like links one way or the other as, communicating similar thing, but according to the medium of the object, it sort of like transforms? So this is one comment, because when you were mentioning the cypress tree, what I've actually read, looking at the cypress trees in Wazir Khan Mosque, especially the tip, if the tip of the cypress tree is slightly tilted, it sort of like means that it's a moment. It symbolizes a moment. And, moment in the sense that, that's the perfect man. So, and also in certain parts, it also symbolizes, the divinity along with the perfect man. So, if it's sort of like the beloved and the divine. So, so somehow, do you think that there is some sort of a transformation or transition within these symbols across these tangible or intangible objects?
Generally, thank you everyone who's sort of, you've all been very kind to sort of enjoy my presentation and to understand as much as you have. And I'm very grateful to all of you. So to answer your question, Nausheen, I mean, for carpet specifically, I can say this, as opposed to for Wazir Khan Masjid, I think this is probably something that Sir Taimoor could maybe say in much better detail. I'm not an architect, unfortunately, even though I've worked with many architects, but I'm not one myself. But jahan tak carpets ki baat hai, wahan a lot of the symbolism that was adapted was from, again, geometric sort of illuminations as well, but also from architecture. So you see a lot of architectural depictions within carpets. And prayer carpets are quite interesting because unke andar, I did not put that many variations of the Lahori prayer carpets because I don't know, like it's quite interesting that Lahore mein aate aate they really sort of simplified certain aspects of the way that certain things were shown because it was considered to be common knowledge. Whereas if you kind of compare the prayer carpets that were being made in the Ottoman empires, usme they really depict everything much more detailed. They'll show a column, they'll show a lamp in the middle to sort of depict the lamp is also supposed to, signify like divine light, and they'll have proper architectural columns made on the side that are often quite mathematically accurate as well. Somehow, when that started transitioning more towards the subcontinent, they started to lose a lot of things, and it became a little bit more, I mean, I don't really like this term, but let's just say abstract for the sake of understanding it. But उसमें हमने काफ़ी उसको simplify करना शुरू कर दिया था. However, I have seen that there is a lot of influence of architectural elements and geometric elements in carpets, and many of them actually sort of symbolize the same thing across both or all three disciplines. And I think that again sort of ties in with generally the broader Islamic aesthetics or the certain associations or meanings we have with some symbols. But for certain specific things that I can recall, the cypress tree that you mentioned, I don't have a lot of knowledge about it. I more understand the color theory behind it because, again, I think that links more closely to the way it was also translated in within textiles. Uska exact, I think, yes, sir, Taimoor would probably know. But carpets के अंदर काफी जो symbolism use होता था, it was adapted from the already existing sort of physical tangible arts or that we already had. I hope that answers your question.
Fatma, it was a wonderful session. It was very interesting, very informative. मैं सिर्फ एक छोटा सा एक्सपीरियंस शेयर करना चाह रही हूँ. बाय चांस हम लोग इस हफ्ते में एक कारपेट इंडस्ट्री गए और विजिट किया एंड दे इनवाइटेड अस. यूनिवर्सिटी में कुछ फैकल्टी को उन्होंने बुलाया अपने पास और मतलब ट्रस्ट मी इट वाज सो इंटरेस्टिंग टू सी द प्रोसेस और जितना उनके पास 50 इयर्स का पीछे डॉक्यूमेंटेड डेटा था डिजाइन्स का जो हाथ के साथ बनाया जाता था. बट अनफॉर्चुनेटली जो ऑनर थे उनका जो मेन कंसर्न था इनवाइट करने का एकेडेमिया को टू द इंडस्ट्री वो ये था कि अब हमारी मार्केट की डिमांड क्योंकि चेंज हो रही है और हमारे अब जो नए क्लाइंट और कस्टमर हैं दे आर जेंजीज एंड दे लाइक फ्यूजन. तो वो ये चाहते हैं कि हमें डिज़ाइन के अंदर इनोवेशन चाहिए या हमें डिज़ाइन के अंदर एक चेंज चाहिए क्योंकि हम यूएस मार्केट को देख रहे हैं या हम यूके की मार्केट को देख रहे हैं. तो मतलब हमें उसके अंदर मतलब वो मतलब चाह ये रहे थे कि उनको आजकल के डिज़ाइन की तरह से कुछ हेल्प मिले. तो यहाँ पर मैं ये मतलब कनेक्ट इस तरह से कर रही हूँ कि देखिए इसकी अपनी इतनी खूबसूरती है और एक अपनी एक आइडेंटिटी है और उसके पीछे पूरा एक नॉलेज है कि एक कारपेट को बनाने का और जितने भी एलिमेंट्स इस्तेमाल हो रहे हैं. तो एक तो ये कि वो हमारी जो एक प्रैक्टिस है वो कितनी ज़्यादा इफेक्ट हो रही है. मतलब वहां पर मैंने एक कारपेट उन्होंने हमें दिखाया जो इसी साल में उन्होंने बनाया और वो चाइनीज मार्केट के लिए था एंड इट वाज इन ब्राइट पिंक कलर विद स्नेक्स ऑन इट लिटरली बिकॉज उन्होंने ये मेंशन किया कि ये स्नेक ईयर है अकॉर्डिंग टू चाइनीज कैलेंडर तो इसलिए उन्होंने उस मार्केट के लिए ये स्नेक बनाया. तो आई मीन वो एस्थेटिक्स इतने चेंज होते जा रहे हैं और जितने भी हम ऑटोमन की बात कर रहे हैं या कलर की भी एक आइडेंटिटी है जैसे आप ब्लू की बात कर रहे हैं रेड की बात कर रहे हैं. तो मतलब उन्होंने जैसे हम कपड़ों के अंदर प्रिंट्स के अंदर हम कलर वेज बनाते हैं ना तो उन्होंने कारपेट्स के अंदर कलर वेज बनाए हुए थे जो कि कहीं पे अच्छे भी नहीं लग रहे थे एस्थेटिक्स के हिसाब से. तो मैं सिर्फ ये एक्सपीरियंस अभी मुझे ये सारी जितनी भी हम चीज़ों पे बात बात कर रहे थे, तो मुझे ये लगा कि बहुत अनजस्टिफाइड होगा अगर इतने खूबसूरत क्राफ्ट को हम लोग इंडस्ट्री लेवल पे जाके इस तरह से चेंज करें और सिर्फ मनी मेकिंग और प्रॉफिट के लिए अगर हम ये चीज़ कर रहे हो। लेकिन ऑनर ने क्योंकि अपना बिजनेस भी रिटेन करना है और मार्केट को भी लेकर चलना है, अपने क्लाइंट्स को भी देखना है, तो बड़ी एक क्रिटिकल सी सिचुएशन है कि मतलब वी आर इन बिटवीन समवेयर, मतलब प्रॉफिट को देखना है या हमने अपनी रूट्स के साथ अपने आप को लेकर चलना है। तो वो एक मतलब मुझे ऐसा लगा ये सारी डिस्कशन के बाद, तो मैं उसको कनेक्ट कर रही थी।
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this comment. Actually, the third part, hopefully, which we'll have, is actually what I will use to connect this. कि industry में अब क्या challenges हैं. So the thing is that I will only give one small comment for this, which my mentor, he says that the best way to lose your culture, he's like the easiest, he's like foolproof way, like, no investment needed. He's like, stop catering to your local market. कहते you will kill your culture in a second. He's like, just stop catering to your local market. And unfortunately, इसके कुछ historical reasons भी हैं, इसके कुछ economic reasons भी, इसके कुछ political reasons भी हैं. पाकिस्तान में जो मैन्युफैक्चरिंग होती है इज नॉट केटर टू द लोकल मार्केट. हम अपने लिए नहीं बनाते कुछ. वी मेक इट फॉर कौन मेरे बाहर से कौन खरीदेगा और हाउ मच मनी कैन आई मेक. And it's become this very sad or weird or bad, however you want to categorize it, snake eating its own head phenomena. Ke we rely on the export, but then we cannot sort of, we can't let go of it, but we also rely. So we're constantly stuck in this very toxic cycle, and we're constantly eating our own tail again and again. बिकॉज हमें नहीं पता और किस तरह सर्वाइव करें. और हमने अपने कल्चर को जब आपने केटर करना खत्म कर दिया है, there is no way your art can survive. Why do you think like now, like we think about it, carpet making, carpet manufacturing is not an industry that it was 50 years ago even, or 60 years, 70 to chalo, but 50 years ago now there's a huge difference. We stopped catering to our people. We wanted dollars, we wanted to export it. And this is not just Pakistan, by the way, this is across the board for many other countries as well. The only country that I actually know of genuinely that are still apne hi logon ke liye wo bana rahe hain, they've had a bit of a small revival, I would say, because I know of a couple of textile artisans that are working, is Morocco. They've completely changed उनकी carpet industry. उनने एकदम से बहुत change किया है, और उनने specifically this initiative they've done a lot more so for, because they wanted to preserve their tribal culture. They wanted to preserve the tribal culture that women were carrying with them. And unfortunately, a lot of the women were not academically educated, but they were vocationally and they were very good with crafting. So they started this initiative to ensure that this tradition maintained or stayed in there, or stayed a part of their identity. And they were like, ab jahan Europe mein, I mean, this is where I primarily am, there more of the demand is for Moroccan carpets. So वो कहते हैं we don't want things जो हमें जल्दी जल्दी मिल जाएं, because even if it's slow, sustainable, that's fine with us. But as long as it's, authentic, genuinely made from there. Ours is very different. हमारी market बहुत different. Before I came to here to Europe, to Austria, I had met some manufacturer. और वो उस वक्त जापानीज उनके क्लाइंट्स काफ़ी थे, so they were catering a lot to the Japanese government and the kind of carpets. He didn't like the carpets he was making, but he's like, what can I do? Nobody buys them. I have to make money. So, but then उसमें फिर और भी issues हैं कि हमारी society को this current capitalistic sort of system, it doesn't suit us. It can't suit us.
Excellent comment. Inshallah, अगले session में इन चीजों पे looking forward to having a conversation on this aspect of things. इतनी देर में फातिमा शाह ने सवाल किया कि ईरानी कार्पेट्स में इतने शायद चेंजेस नहीं हुए because of the embargo and no sales to the West, most probably. What do you think?
Iran, I think, is very difficult to compare because उन लोगों का totally different, their situation was completely different from ours. They honestly didn't actually change their aesthetics for the longest time. But Iran के अंदर domestically भी बहुत डिमांड है कार्पेट्स की. That's why जो अभी तक survive कर गए हैं, despite the crazy embargoes that they still have by the US, by Europe, by the EU, by North America, Canada, whatever. The only reason that Iranian carpets, even though उनका भी काफी industry it's shrunk a lot now, but the only reason why they've somewhat survived is because they still have a domestic client and they cater to it. वो बनाते ही चीजें अपने लोगों के लिए. They make it according to the demands of their local culture, their local aesthetics. They export it. It's like a cultural export, yes, but they still very much prioritize their own people. Something that we haven't really done.
Excellent, excellent. Sahi, I think we had a good session, and thank you for that, where all the participants and to Fatma.
Yes, hopefully. And thank you very much for having me. Thank you to everybody who made time. Thank you, Hast, for giving me this platform. Very grateful to be able to talk about these things.